On this edition of FedGov Today with Francis Rose, sponsored by Maximus, the upside ahead for reshaping government buying.
The automation opportunities here are amazing when you start really using AI as it matures. With all of that, there's also an investment.
Former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Defense Acquisition Reform, Stan Soloway, on FedGov Today in just a moment. Uniting program strategy, advanced technology, process, and execution for a more efficient government. That's Maximus. Every program, every service, every time, that's innovation forward. Learn more at maximus.com/federal. The federal government should buy commercial software wherever it can, according to a new White House executive order. The EO also says the federal acquisition regulation's about to get a shot of Ozempic. Stan Soloway is president and CEO of Solero Strategies. He's former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Defense Acquisition Reform. He's writing about the EOs in NextGov. Stan, welcome. Thanks for joining me. You write, let's set aside some of the rhetoric surrounding the order and focus instead on what it actually requires. What's the rhetoric that you think is distracting people about this EO? Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be with you, Francis. It was kind of a throwaway bit because I thought there was some language that came out of some of the leadership that was kind of old school, kind of the FARs never worked, and it was very trite. The real point, I think, though, of what they're trying to do is what matters, and that is actually get at modernizing a set of regulations that are not only 2,000 plus pages, but as I said in the piece, I mean, the first time the government ever used AI, it was to help decipher the acquisition regulations, which is absurd in the extreme. So let's forget about the little snarky comment I maybe made about the rhetoric that accompanied the order and focus on the opportunity that's there, which I think is real.
You're right. This has the potential to move the needle forward in important and positive ways. What are those ways, and what is the risk of squandering the opportunity in your view, Stan?
Well, you and I have known each other a long time, and even since before we met, I mean, there have been efforts to reform and change the acquisition process for the last 40 years. The last really big shift was 30 plus years ago, was 30 years ago, I mean, in terms of really major change. And since then, there's been a lot of backslidings, but these opportunities don't come along very often. And I think that this team is serious. I give them credit for that. So what do they need to do? I think that this is an opportunity to refocus the federal acquisition regulation on the modern environment, which is the government's not a monopsony buyer anymore. Technology is ubiquitous. We should be using commercial buying strategies for just about everything we buy other than the most unique government requirements. And that is, in procurement speak, FAR Part 12, which is the commercial buying authorities in the federal acquisition regulation, as it was originally created. Because since it was created, there has been, as I said, backsliding and dilution. But if we go back to the original model, I think it offers a real opportunity for the government to significantly modernize how it buys and significantly improve its access to the marketplace. The other side of that coin, though, is to get there, it's not just a matter of changing policy. There's a human capital dimension. There's a financial resource dimension in terms of investing in training and development and making sure that we don't just focus on contracting officers, but look at the entire system. But the opportunity, I think, is very real.
You write, it's notable that when opportunities have emerged in the past to take a clean sheet approach to federal acquisition, the end result very often looked much like Part 12, as Part 12 was originally envisioned. Where has then, post those efforts, where have people gone wrong in kind of getting people back to the situation we're in, where here we are again, as you say, taking crack number 542 at acquisition reform?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I'll use one example to highlight what I'm talking about. There's an alternative method for procurement called other transactions authorities, where basically it allows certain agencies of the government to enter into commercial contracts with the terms and conditions outside of the FAR. Most of it, and I did a significant study on this a couple of years ago. If you look at most of those contracts, they're called agreements in government speak, but they're actually contracts. If you look at most of them, they look a lot like Part 12 contracts, like Part 12 was conceived of. What's the difference between that and what we have now is that there have been scores of clauses added to Part 12 of the FAR that have diluted its effectiveness. And what we've seen with other transactions is as they progress from experimentation to production, the adding into them of FAR clauses. So in other words, they lose their purity, if you will. And it causes the commercial players, the non-traditional contractors, essentially walk away at that point. Very few of them stay in the game. So if you really want to maintain access to the marketplace, you've got to maintain the business model that got you access originally. The good news is, and the other example I use in the piece is the FAA, which had a blue ribbon commission many years ago. And the model they came out looked a lot like a Part 12 contract. And that, I don't know as much about how that has diluted or not. I haven't focused there as much there. But the good news is, if you look at these models, they all meet all the basic tests of federal procurement. What are we looking for? We're looking for fairness, competition, transparency. All of those pieces exist. And I think particularly because, and this is the key issue, and it's not a new one, but it's I think being highlighted by this executive order. The government is not a monopsony buyer anymore. And the federal acquisition regulation was largely written at a time when the government was. In other words, it was the only or the primary customer for almost all of the vendors. That is far from the case today. So it's about time the government adapted to the marketplace rather than expecting the marketplace to adapt to it.
Well, and that was at a time, too, where a lot of the stuff, especially software that the federal government bought, was created specifically for the federal government. And if one ties the other part of the executive order about buying commercial first to the acquisition piece that we're discussing right now, it seems pretty obvious to me that what the intersection of those two things is.
I think that's exactly right. And I think that, one of the nuances that need to be that we need to be aware of is, I used to hear people say, well, COTS, commercial off the shelf, COTS doesn't work in our environment. Well, very little software is of any significance is COTS in quotes. If you talk to software companies, and I've done work with companies that do a lot of commercial work, they have to do a substantial amount of modification, even in the commercial environment, because every company's systems are different and so forth. That doesn't mean they're changing the guts of the software, but there is modification. What Part 12 allows you to do is to treat those modifications still as a commercial item. And that's the big difference. And that was actually a very big debate back in the 90s, whether it had to be exactly the same as what was sold commercially versus modified for government use. And the popular and absolutely true example was, if the Army wanted to buy T-shirts from Hanes, they couldn't buy them commercially because Hanes didn't make a T-shirt in Army green. Literally, that was kind of the stuff we were doing. Now, take that to a software world where the engineering involved and the modest minor modifications involved in major installations are not insignificant. It's not all plug and play world.
The greatest example of that is office productivity software during the pandemic, because all of the agencies, not everybody used the same thing. Some used different providers, but they were all commercial products that were immediately and rapidly adapted to whatever the environment was that the agency had in place, whatever their architecture was. Am I on the right track there?
Look at how quickly Zoom came out with a commercial version. But the last thing, I don't want to lose this point, though, that as we go down this path of commerciality, which is really critical, and with the advent of AI, which is going to be an extraordinarily valuable tool, which is going to be able to enable the government to really streamline routine procurements. I mean, the automation opportunities here are amazing when you start really using AI as it matures. With all of that, there's also an investment. Procurement offices have to have the right equipment. It has to be upgraded. There are device replacement strategies in the government that are now rarely met. So you could have 5-year-old laptops or devices that simply cannot handle, have operating systems can't handle newer technology. So it all has to be aligned with resource commitments, both at the personnel level, and I'm very concerned about the personnel cuts impacting the government's ability to do what they want to do, and resources, which are the dollar side of it, because they all go together.
You mentioned earlier all the contract clauses, and you write in this piece 150 layered onto FAR Part 12, many of which have no statutory basis. And that makes me think not just about the FAR Part 12 issues, but more broadly about this issue of trying to turn the FAR into a 100-page document from a 2,000-page document. Is it necessary, in your view, to understand why someone might have wanted to implement those changes originally to put them in the FAR, as one thinks about taking them out, or is it sufficient to just go through the FAR and say, this isn't relevant, this isn't statutory, so we can exit?
I think it's the former very, very strongly. And they have a very aggressive 6-month timeline to get this done. And I think, when we did the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act, which was the big bill in the 90s, it took us over a year to get it done. I think that it's not just the clauses that have been added to Part 12. It's just the technology associated with clause logic for the government contract writing systems is not insignificant because there's so much of it. And I do think there has to be some reasoned assessment. And number one, the fact that it wasn't required by statute doesn't mean it's not reasonable. Those two don't necessarily go together. So I think the statutory question that I raised was that nobody made the government, the agencies do this, but it doesn't mean that some of the clauses may not have some relevance going forward. So you have to do the analysis, and that's the good news is that there have been a number of reports done over the years that have tried to do that. If you look a few years ago, I think you probably had some of the folks on who did this, what was called the Section 809 panel,
yep,
which did a 2.5-year study of all of this. So you have a lot of baseline research that's already been done. But the other reason that it's really important to build the case on a almost clause by clause basis and have it solid is if the change is going to be really significant, you're going to have buy-in across the community. You're going to have to buy in from the oversight community, you have to buy in from Congress, buy-in from the legal community, and so forth. And so you have to be able to justify to folks who felt like this audit provision or this requirement for data and you have to have an answer. So it's important to look at all of the significant clauses and have a very clear understanding of why they should be replaced. I think it's entirely feasible to do it, but you got to do the legwork to get it there. I don't think it's going to get to 100 pages. I'd take 500 and consider it a great victory. It's the simplification and clarity that's really required.
Stan, it's great to talk to you as always, my friend. Thanks for your time.
Great to see you. Thanks, Francis.
You can find a link to Stan's piece on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. One of the candidates to become the next chief of naval operations is on the next FedGov Today TV. The commander of Navy Fleet Forces Command, Admiral Darrell Caudle, will tell you how his service's One Atlantic concept has matured. You can watch the show this Sunday morning at 10:30 on ABC7 in Washington and on the FedGov Today YouTube channel. If you missed the debut of the show, you can watch it on demand anytime at fedgovtoday.com and on YouTube. The Defense Department makes a big commitment to open systems architecture. You'll meet one of the trailblazers in that field on the next FedGov Today podcast. Nick Girton will be here next Tuesday. You can listen to every FedGov Today podcast anytime you want on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or on demand at fedgovtoday.com. I'm Francis Rose. Thanks very much for listening.